How long have you been active in the search?
Really active since 2006. I got started sort of 2000. It had always been in the back of my mind. I'd worked in forestry in the 90s. And I thought about it and I asked a few followers, but it was like, wasn't a big topic of conversation, right? And nobody wants to lose their job because, you know, a giant spotted owl is now in the woods. Yeah, 2006, I took a trip down to Northern California, went on an expedition down there. It was horrible. 2 back-to-back Pineapple Express, raindrops as big as shooter marbles. So Matt said, well, listen, that was horrible. Why don't you go on a second trip? Don't worry about it, you won't have to pay. So I went on the island, and I guess I made a good impression. So Matt said, well, you want to be an investigator? So attended dozens of expeditions over the years, started doing my own in 2016 up the Harrison watershed. And yeah, relatively fruitful. Drummed up a number of visuals. Sadly, we didn't catch anything. But I mean, like I said, it's the nature of the beast. You know, these sightings are often just fleeting. And I can see why people don't catch them on camera. I've been running down a logging road. I've got a camera in my hand. I see a big bull elk come out onto the road. You just stand there and gawk. You don't want to distract with the camera because you want to take in every second of what you're seeing. So it doesn't surprise me that there aren't many photos of these things. You know, A, the sighting is fleeting, and B, you're standing there gawking, and especially for somebody who thinks these things don't exist. Yeah, they just stand there and absorb what they're seeing. Right. Yeah. And then they think about who they're going to tell, which is often nobody. Yeah. Right?
Not only that, but just as you mentioned how fleeting they are. I mean, I've had a gigantic bull moose run out in the road in front of me, and by the time I had a camera or phone ready, it was already in the tree line and gone.
That's
and
right.
We're talking something that has, you know, a 10-foot span of its antlers.
That's
so
right. Yeah, it's a
something that
beast.
maybe could blend in a little better, I could see might just be very difficult to even spot, let alone be able to film. So I heard a story the other day at the Sasquatch conference about an airplane that had been missing since, I believe, either the 40s or the 50s out on Vancouver Island. It was just rediscovered maybe less than a decade ago.
Yeah.
So it brought some closure to the families, but we're talking a large airplane that was stationary and wasn't able to be located. Shiny, that was in the trees, and then Sasquatch moves around. So what really are the chances of, you know, moving needle in a haystack?
That's right, yeah. Well, as my friend Bill Miller used to say, you could hide a dinosaur back here and nobody would know.
For nearly a century, the search for Bigfoot has captivated the imaginations of millions of people around the globe. Today, fascination with the phenomenon is as widespread as some of the most recognizable symbols in history and pop culture. The sideways silhouette, arm-swinging Sasquatch profile is so ingrained in the minds of many people that most are likely unable to recall when or where they first encountered it. Deeper still is the fixation with the creature amongst those who endeavor to search for it. It takes a special kind of person to set aside the necessities and distractions of modern life to set off in search of the theoretical American wood ape, and today, there are many of them. While the idea of Sasquatch and the pursuit of it may be an institution in 2025, they sprung from the humblest of beginnings, a few intrepid explorers on the fringe of the scientific world, daring to ask a question that many would balk at. The world has not always watched the woods for Sasquatch, at least not in the great numbers of today. It began in the late 1800s and early 1900s as stories of strange, ape-like creatures, sometimes described as wild men or cannibals, began to circulate through newspapers and whispered rumors. We may never know the full breadth of the old Sasquatch stories, and we may assume that countless encounters have certainly been lost to time, but some remnants do survive. Enough to give us some idea of where our obsession with Sasquatch began, and to allow us to trace the road which leads to now. Many of these early tales and rumors were drawn from much older stories, some dating back as far as the birth of the United States, or even earlier, of bizarre human-like beings lurking in the hills, mountains, and forests of North America. They are still remembered and held with varying degrees of veracity by the research community. One of the earliest modern reports also touts one of the prime examples of alleged Sasquatch evidence: footprints. Jerry Crew was a tractor operator working at a remote job site in Six Rivers National Forest in 1958. He would discover a series of footprints, 16-inch long footprints, around his job site one morning, and the incident became a national sensation. The veracity of the prints has been subjugated to rigorous scrutiny, but whether a hoax or a real example of evidence, the Jerry Crew report has become a focal point in the history of the evolution of the Sasquatch question. The fact that the Crew incident took place so close to the infamous Bluff Creek, the location where the notorious Patterson-Gimlin film was captured, only a couple of hours by car, is considered no small coincidence, whether hoax or otherwise. Crew's encounter and the notorious Bluff Creek incident are staple cases which stand out amongst a few noteworthy others with regard to getting the ball rolling. While these early tales laid a foundation, the phenomenon is not limited to a single window in time in the early and mid-century. Once the eyes of the world fell on the Sasquatch question, they would remain there, whether from the viewpoint of skeptical dismissal, casual interest, or outright belief. This is due largely in part to the pioneers of the topic, who began investigating potential Bigfoot activity long before it was fashionable.
As far as historical accounts of Bigfoot types go, you seem to have possibly various species. You know, you've got the Paddy types, and then you've got the Neanderthal-looking types, and even lizard man, you know, maybe even dog man or werewolf type beings. But the common trait that they seem to have is this giant creature that's covered in hair that lives out in the wilderness. Going way back to even to ancient Greece, there are tales of wild men in North Africa and in India. In Greek mythology, you've got these two characters, Agreos and Oreos, who are these half-bear, half-man brothers that are cannibalistic. You know, and they live out, and their names actually mean, you know, savage man or man of the mountain. Patristic writers would refer to wild men as representative of either being demonic or heretical. In medieval Europe, there are lots of Germanic tales of monsters coming from the swamps or the mountains or the woods into villages to kidnap people or to eat people and all, which is where you get Grendel from Beowulf coming into the civilized space. The wild man image is prevalent in art, especially in the Middle Ages. And you've got all these sort of forest-dwelling images like the Green Man, the Spriggan. In Slavic culture, you've got, or Slavic mythology, you've got this creature called Leshy, that's sort of this forest entity, the kind of giant Green Man type. You've got the Viennese Krampus, you know, which is sort of this beast that shows up at Christmas time. Even Scandinavian trolls and ogres of folklore have that same idea that they live out in the mountains or in the woods or in the forest, and it's when they enter into, you know, these giant creatures enter into civilized space that there are problems. When the Vikings came to the New World in 986 AD, Leif Erikson talks about seeing these hairy giants.
We are able to trace the origin of the term Sasquatch. It was John W. Burns who, in 1920, even before the famous Ape Canyon incident of 1924, would form a relationship with the Chehalis First Nations group of tribes, and through this relationship learn of the hairy man legends which had existed in the Washington state area for untold centuries.
In 1920s, in Canada, they started using a new word, Sasquatch, and that started oozing into some of the reports. So you have this progression and evolution of words Some of the 1924 newspaper reports talk about forest giants or forest devils. So everybody used different words to try to capture something that today we know entirely as Bigfoot. Bigfoot is a word that's used in Canada, Russia, China, everywhere, and it's become the global word to deal with hairy hominids.
So in the 1920s, you've got John W. Burns working with the Chehalis Indians and finding out about these hairy man legends. And of course, that's where we get the term Sasquatch from.
The two variations I am aware, like here in the Harrison area, it is Sasquatch, and that's kind of where Sasquatch came from. Like, J.W. Burns, of course, was an Indian agent, and he'd spent time with the Chehalis tribe here in Harrison, and he would hear them refer to it as Sasquatch. But when he went and wrote his first article, he called it Sasquatch in Maclean's magazine. And that's kind of where the Sasquatch stuck and came from. And whereas up in the interior, it's strunatum, and I'm sure other parts, if you go to different parts of the province, they've got variations on that. It's like each tribe has its wild man legend. And each one would then give it its own name. But Sasquatch is kind of the catch-all, and it started here in Harrison Hot Springs.
So as far as the Native American hairy man stuff, they seem to fall into two categories. One is sort of this nurturing guardian of the forest that kind of oversees the different tribes. And you've got the Dakota tribe. They have the Shiatanka, which means like elder brother. But then others are these sort of violent cannibals that come down and kidnap children and women. And the Bella Coola tribe has the Bok or the Skookum that means evil genie. The Iroquois has the stone man that evidently was human at one time but was cursed to be this sort of forest dweller. But the shared characteristics of these, whether they're benevolent or not, seems to be this hairy giant that lives in the forest.
The history of Bigfoot reports in newspapers going back to the 1800s has morphed over time. At first they were described largely in terms of the wild man.
Before the Bigfoot word was used, newspaper reporters, eyewitnesses, everybody involved with this phenomena, including native peoples, had to use other words. Those words included things like wild man. A lot of newspaper reports from the 1920s back to the 1860s talk about wild men that seemed to almost mirror feral humans. But they were covered in hair, they were never caught, and you had situations over and over again where people would use the word wild man.
Everything from the figures being described in terms of just long-haired humans, in some cases even wearing clothing, and living off almost in a hermit-like fashion, to kind of taking on different racial profile elements as well, that these days are kind of a hot button topic to talk about.
In the 1860s in Africa, gorillas were all in the news, so that became a default word that some people used in the reports.
But that started to change over time. Part of that, I think, had to do with the introduction of the discovery of the gorilla, and great apes started to become a feature of how these were being reported in the newspapers of the era, and that started to color the way that even the language was used. You know, much of the time the language of like a gorilla or like an ape started to replace the language of the wild man, and that was pretty easy to trace through those early reports. To the degree that in the early 1900s, almost exclusively they were being talked about in terms of a gorilla-like, or at the very least half man, half ape, where at first you had a real emphasis on the wild man, or sort of the hermit that had stayed out in the woods too long and was now going, almost feral.
So I guess if we think about the wild man reports of the 1800s, maybe in the newspapers, those probably didn't hurt in selling newspapers, and that was probably something that people looked forward to reading, as well as maybe addressed a fear that pioneers might have had going out into this unknown wilderness.
Bigfoot is really nothing new to Pennsylvania. There have been reports that apparently are associated with the Native Americans going back many, many years. And there are numerous newspaper accounts from across the state of Pennsylvania that talk about sightings of Bigfoot, and strange footprints were found throughout the state. And so it was something that was even known back so many years ago. The earliest firsthand account where I've actually interviewed a witness goes back to 1931 from Indian Head up in Fayette County. And Fayette County historically is one of those areas along the Chestnut Ridge that continues to produce many Bigfoot reports, including almost annually. So there have been a lot of reports in these general areas, and even the older reports, from what we could tell, were very similar to what people are reporting today. A lot of these creatures generally range from 6 to about 9 feet tall, even though some smaller ones have been reported. Generally sometimes very broad-shouldered, very long arms, sometimes extending down beyond the knees, almost to the ground in some cases. And many of the Bigfoot reports are in daylight. It seems that some people are of the opinion that Bigfoot is a nocturnal animal, that it's only seen at night. But actually, many of the better sightings here in Pennsylvania are occurring here in daylight. And many have been at very, very close range. So when we talk about very close range Bigfoot observations, we're talking incidents where these creatures are walked out in front of vehicles, 5, 10, 15 feet away from the eyewitnesses, or walked near mobile homes or other rural communities. And while we talk about a lot of sightings in rural communities, in more recent years, we're continuing to get sighting reports in more populated areas where there's not a lot of the woods around, which adds even more and more to the mystery.
You start getting the reports of eastern Bigfoot, and it gets confused because people look in the archives for something that says Bigfoot or Sasquatch. You have the terminology problem. Back in the day, the Algonquin Indians, who have 500, 600 years of records of hairy creatures, they're called Wendigo. So you have to look for the right words, look for the right language. And the Cherokee Indian have certain traditions that have different names. There's 457 tribal groups in the United States. You can go from tribal group to tribal group, and everybody has a different name for what we call Bigfoot today. Even in terms of English language newspapers, that's where you have the wild man reports. 1869 in Kansas, you had groups of wild man reports. You had in Whaling River, New York, you have accounts in the 1930s of ape-like creatures in the woods there. Are these Bigfoot? Are they skunk apes that are transplanted? In Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, you have very early reports of some of these creatures that seem more aggressive, more ape-like.
But this obsession with Sasquatch and the availability of places to discuss it did not happen overnight. Our modern-day fixation with the creature began long ago, as early stories, rumors, and native legends paved the way for the modern acknowledgement of this phenomenon we refer to as Bigfoot. We are left to a scattered tapestry of historical sightings which are still being dug up in the modern day as researchers pore over articles, historical documents, and simple one-off notes that would otherwise be lost to history. It is essential when viewing the Sasquatch phenomenon in the modern day to look through the historical lens of archival reports. To do so, however, requires a bit of footwork. Identifying the earliest Sasquatch reports is a challenge. In truth, it can be difficult to know where to begin looking. Even the newspaper articles of the 18 and 1900s do not give us the full story. There are even older tales which predate any European presence on the North American continent, which many take as validation of the Sasquatch presence there. Even some vaunted historical figures such as Daniel Boone and Teddy Roosevelt are said to have connections to the creature. We are, despite some missing historical data, able to trace the root of the term we often use to describe these hypothetical animals.
The scientists were asking for physical evidence to support the stories of the reported creature. In 1958, Gerald Crew was building a new road in a wilderness area in Northern California. For several mornings in a row, he noted there were huge, human-like footprints around his bulldozer. He obtained some plaster of Paris and made casts of them. Here now was physical evidence of something that made tracks. Some scientists say they are made by a prankster. Here is another investigator, René Dahinden.
No scientist ever came out in the bush to look at the footprints which we found. No scientists ever studied these tracks. They're sitting there saying they're faked without ever having seen footprints in the area where we found them. No technical evaluation was ever made. In my opinion, after having seen 3,000 footprints myself of 6 different sizes, I came to the conclusion this tracks to be made by a living foot, a creature with a foot like this, a Sasquatch, rather than a man with artificial feet.
In the 1950s, Six Rivers National Forest was one of the last national forests in Region 5, which is the region that I work in, to really open itself up to logging. And so most national forests were, the Park Service is conservation, the Bureau of Land Management is mostly for extraction. The Forest Service is a mixture of both. We both conserve, preserve, but wise use on the land as well. Mostly being harvesting of timber for the production of homes or other businesses, industry in the United States. The Six Rivers National Forest was one of the last of those forests to open itself up to logging. And so it had very, very few roads out in the National Forest for logging trucks to drive to, have the timber cut down, and then removed from the landscape. So in the 1950s, Jerry Crew was working on a contract to build some of those logging roads into the forest to begin that process. And he would work and then leave his equipment, and the next day he kept finding these large footprints around his equipment, plus stuff moved, like 50-gallon fuel barrels. Well, you know, those are kind of heavy. Who has the ability to move something that heavy? And so he's just trying to figure this out. So finally, he decides he's going to cast one of the most beautiful footprints there are, and it gets into the national press, and the term Bigfoot gets coined. And so that's sort of how this all started with that term. And that area was known as the Bluff Creek area, became extremely popular. Later on, that's where the Roger Patterson, Bob Gimlin film would be filmed. Due to similar circumstances where there are all these prints being found in the area, and they go there to try to figure out what's going on and captured the famous film that we're aware of. So.
After the Jerry Crew stories hit the papers, and that started to get a nationwide sort of understanding of what the phenomena was, either by osmosis or people finally feeling like it was okay to talk about it, there was a growing sense that various locations had their own histories of wild man, Sasquatch, and Bigfoot reports that really seemed to hit a peak in the 1970s, where all of a sudden stories were coming out of the general Midwest, coming out of the South, and even the East Coast and the extreme Northeast part of the United States. And it seems like there were, again, a number of things that tended to tie these stories together. One was waterway systems, whether it was swampy areas or along riverbeds or creeks, those tended to be the places where these creatures were seen emerging from or returning to once they were sighted. And I think that along with some type of wooded cover, is a kind of a generalization across the board, that you could trace sighting reports and creature reports to all of these different locations that had the commonality of some type of water system, some type of cover that would involve a wooded area. And then, of course, if this is a living biological entity, they would have to have something to eat as well. So it would have to be a location that supported other wildlife, or at the very least, some type of vegetation that these creatures could eat.
Perhaps the most startling and far-reaching event in the recent history of Bigfoot hunting happened to a long-time investigator by the name of Roger Patterson. In October of 1967, he and a friend were in the Bluff Creek area of Northern California to investigate a reported sighting of two creatures. Suddenly his horse shied as a large creature stood erect from behind a log where it had been drinking from the creek. Patterson grabbed a 16-millimeter camera from the saddlebag and jumped from the back of the rearing horse to take the following pictures. Let's hear in Patterson's words exactly what happened that day.
As I walked across the sandbar, I was able to get some fairly good footage of it. It turned a couple of times and looked at us, and as it turned, it seemed to give me the impression that it didn't want anything to do with us. It didn't run, it didn't act scared, but yet it acted leery of us.
Patterson thought that he had proved once and for all that the creatures existed, but he found that even the film was in question.
The most famous piece of evidence in Bigfoot history is the Patterson-Gimlin film. The film is very famous because, as I often say, it's evidence of pancaking the evidence. You had native traditions. That's the exact similar place in Bluff Creek where the 1958 discovery of Bigfoot occurred. You had two individuals who saw something, horses reacted, they take a film, and then they got cast. So there's many different layers of evidence coming from that one incident.
The history of that is one that to this day is not necessarily easy to pinpoint where the film went to, under what conditions was it developed, and where all of the existent copies are. So there is some interesting questions still, I think, outstanding about how that film came to be. However, it was then taken rather quickly and put in front of various groups of scholars and scientists, and the reaction was somewhat predictable. Even though, Roger and Bob had what appeared to be proof positive that this creature really existed, the reaction was a collective shrug of the shoulders, and for the most part, a rejection that this was proof that a creature really existed. That didn't stop Roger, however, from taking the movie on the road and doing a whole four-wall tour with the film throughout the Pacific Northwest for sure, and perhaps even other parts of the country, advertising in local papers that he had this footage to show, and then having people come into the theater and see for themselves what they thought.
Well, the old adage is seeing is believing. So I think for me still, the Patterson-Gimlin film is obviously still a great piece of evidence.
It to this day remains a source of great debate. A lot depends on the frame rate at which the subject was filmed. That's an ongoing source of debate as well. But depending on who you ask, there seems to be in this footage either a man in a suit or you have a legitimate, inexplicable image of something that science hasn't cataloged walking away up the creek bed.
But the PG film, I've looked at it literally thousands of times. I have every single frame of the film in photographic form. I've watched it enhanced, I've watched it cleared up, I've watched it in its natural state. And there's no way that you could tell me that that's a man in a suit, because fabric covers muscle movement. You cannot get a suit, okay, at least in 1967, that was skin tight to the point where the musculature could be seen, and the movements of the musculature in very particular ways could be observed.
And there's very compelling anecdotal evidence and suggestion that the ability to create what we see in that film as sort of a Hollywood special effects project, that the technology and the ability to do that simply didn't exist without a huge amount of money to put into the project. And even then, the anatomy of the creature and the things that seem to be observed in this film are not the type of things that someone would think to include in a monster costume.
Another term, as widely known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot, would gain infamy well before either of these names, and unlike much of the rest of the modern Bigfoot saga, does not originate in North America, but rather far off Asia. As explorers set off into the Himalayan mountains in search of fame and notoriety, they also encountered stories of impossible, unknown creatures, which struck fear into the hearts of native inhabitants. Explorers such as Sir Edmund Hillary and Eric Shipton would return from the Himalayas with frightening tales of upright creatures, leaving long tracks of footprints in the snow and howling into the wintry nights. The Yeti, or the abominable snowman, would attract the attention not only of the average newspaper reader, but also of the very wealthy and well-connected. Some with both the interest and the means to pursue the creature would put their money where their mouths were, forever imprinting their names right alongside the hidden creature itself.
One of the things that was missing from some of the early searches for the Yeti was good funding. Along comes a Texas oil and beef millionaire who was fascinated by these reports of a mysterious hairy creature in Nepal. He got hold of Bernard Heuvelmann's book, On the Track of the Unknown Animals, which came out in English in 1958. And he really was so fascinated by this because he was an inventor, and he also was interested in medical discoveries. And he felt if the first Yeti could be captured, brought back to Texas, it could become the standard medical model for testing new diseases or new cures for disease. Tom Slick at the time had the largest rhesus monkey population in the world that he was using in medical research. So he really saw the Yeti as an extension of his medical inventions and his medical solutions to different diseases. So he actually, with a guy named Peter Byrne, decided to go on a little trip over there in 1957 and to explore the possibilities for larger expeditions. He unfortunately got in an accident. A bus lost its brakes and was going down a hill, and he damaged his knee so much. And he was he was in his 30s and 40s and during all of this time, and he actually came back, and his mother said, "Do not go back." His family was afraid he was going to kill himself looking for the Yeti. So he got hold of Peter Byrne and his brother Brian Byrne, and he started setting up these expeditions in 58 and 59. And then Tom Slick saw that it would be a lot easier if he could conduct these research and these expeditions in the Americas. So he transferred the whole operation over to California and British Columbia in the beginning of the 60s. Then, unfortunately, he died in a plane crash. The funding stopped.
In the years that followed the spread of these and many, many other early fantastical rumors, a core group of early researchers took to the forests and hills in pursuit of these legendary creatures. Before the days of thermal imaging, drones, and DNA analysis, a dedicated corps of enthusiastic Sasquatch hunters set off into the wilderness in search of the American wood ape. There are many names one can attribute as being the sort of founding fathers of the Bigfoot search. Among them are those often and affectionately referred to as the Four Horsemen, early figures in the research community who paved new roads, establishing the groundwork for the modern search for Sasquatch. They were often at odds with one another, and their history is a colorful and interesting tale of overlapping research and contrasting viewpoints. It can be argued that they swung some of the first blows in tearing down the wall which separated the search for Sasquatch from any real scientific legitimacy, and many now follow in their footsteps, striving to preserve and continue their legacy. Peter Byrne, raised on stories of the Himalayan Yeti, the British Royal Air Force veteran would embark on his own searches for the so-called abominable snowman, becoming nearly synonymous with the idea of Sasquatch. Later, he would join forces with millionaire industrialist Tom Slick, who would finance much of Byrne's research as he searched for Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest. He and Tom Slick both are considered by many to be legendary figures.
Probably one of the more interesting characters of that is Peter Byrne. He was a big game hunter from Nepal and had quite the stellar reputation. He was also hired by Tom Slick to do some Yeti research, but Tom wanted him to come out here to California and also do research on this Bigfoot.
He headed up the expedition for Tom Slick and then Tom Page, first in Nepal and then for Page and Slick over in the Americas.
And Peter was an amazing raconteur and true adventurer and an actual hunting guide and true tracker hunter. People tended to dismiss him, especially when I came in first into the field, and they were, oh, Peter's full of tall tales, or he's this bigger than life character and you're not sure about him. But you know what? I've spent time in Nepal with him actually hunting tigers for our cameras on the ground and being charged 3 times going out on elephants. Peter was 86 when he rode elephants every day for a month with us. Okay, so he is the real deal. He is tough as nails, and everything that he told me he did.
Peter Byrne, being one of the Four Horsemen, I think his importance stems from the fact that he was out there leading the charge. You know, he very much had that persona of the wilderness hunter. And I think that was a huge feature of the late 50s and early 60s Bigfoot hunt, was people very much wanted to believe that there was a frontier yet to explore. And Peter Byrne embodied that search, going out there, being the hunter, being the tracker, and nothing was going to stand in the way of him ultimately proving that this is just a creature that's out there that's yet to be discovered, and together we're going to go find the thing. You know, Byrne, I think, also goes maybe more uncredited than he should be at being someone who was interested in creating a database of knowledge. And he at least had headquarters in Oregon and was able to send people out, as mostly himself, but to send researchers out to try and gather reports and establish that pool of information.
Peter Byrne, hey, a guy raised more money for Bigfoot early on than anybody else. $3 million, I think, by the early 90s he'd raised, mid-90s or something like that. He ran the Mount Hood research project for a long time. You know, he was very credible as a researcher. He didn't believe in any airy-fairy ideas about Bigfoot. He really believed in tracking a flesh and blood creature on the ground in the woods, and he had a lot of theories about how creatures hide and such, which we featured in Sasquatch Odyssey.
John Green, a Canadian researcher and author, Green would receive thousands of Sasquatch reports during his career. He penned numerous books on the Bigfoot topic, many of which are highly sought after by book collectors and Sasquatch hunters to this day. Green was one of the men to investigate the notorious Bluff Creek tracks in 1958 and forever cement his intrepid legacy, relegating him to a status nearly as legendary as the creature itself.
With John Green, you have the background and the acumen of a skilled reporter and someone who is able to write in a very winsome way all of the reports that were coming in, synthesizing the reports, creating what is essentially the first database of sighting reports, and doing so in a way that would make just about anyone interested in at least listening to what he had to say.
John Green was very much he was a newspaper man, and he wanted just the facts. He wanted, when sightings happen, go there, investigate it, just write down the facts, and he started a database. He was one of the first people that ever published anything. And most people, their introduction to Bigfoot is John Green's initial books from Washington, Oregon, British Columbia.
He sort of solidified Sasquatch research. He treated it seriously like a journalist would. I was an investigative journalist for 10 years, a crime reporter. You do research into the phenomenon, you interview all the people involved, you take the facts back that you got and you put forward kind of an idea or a story. And he did that with sort of every Bigfoot report that he heard. And he would go out to the site, he'd talk to everybody, he'd bring it back. He kind of created the first real database, but like back then on like these index cards, writing all the details that he could, like, you know, the hair color, if he saw footprints, how tall it was, and he had them like with a map that kind of connected everything. And then that eventually became an online database. And of course, he used that material for his books. And the first book had the Ruby Creek incident, of course, the Albert Osman incident.
I think he struck people as objective as possible because of his background and because of his sort of an easygoing manner, but also an attention to detail and a way of networking with people that was very open. And I think he was known for that.
John Green, you know, was kind of the mayor of Harrison Hot Springs for a while as well, and he helped organize the first Sasquatch festival. And so he definitely, you know, was a big part of the tourism industry that came to Harrison Hot Springs. And I have to say, so that's the area of the Chehalis Indians, and I've done a lot of work with Native Americans. Many years, 15, 20 years or more, I made films together with Native communities. And so I work with the Chehalis, and that's their word. A Sasquatch is a variation of the word they have for big and strong. It's also related to a Chinook word called skookum, which means big and strong. But it's from that area. So that is the birthplace of Sasquatch, is Harrison. And that's where John Green was located.
Grover Krantz, an anthropologist and professor at Washington State University, is considered to be one of the first academics to give the Sasquatch its day in court. Krantz would compare and analyze Sasquatch reports and evidence, cross-referencing them with known factors in the scientific record, making case for the creature's potential existence despite widespread abject skepticism. While his reputation in academic circles suffered as a result, he is held in high regard in the cryptozoology community, considered a hero and pioneer. Many today hope to vindicate Krantz's legacy in the modern scientific community.
Grover Krantz, of course, brought with him a sense of legitimacy from an academic standpoint, which I think some of the other four horsemen and others were very desirous of. They really wanted to be taken seriously by the scientific establishment.
And then Grover Krantz was the first academic who was willing, worked for a college in Washington, was willing to stick his neck out and say, this is worth studying, we need to know more information. His original book, Big Footprints, is probably the book I would recommend to anybody in the beginning, because it gives you such an insight of melding what he knew about primate behavior, what he then hypothesized Bigfoot behavior was also like, and it was a very powerful understanding of, based on sightings, that what we were seeing was matching primate, and we shouldn't separate this as being a human species, but being some sort of an ape species.
He always fought, you know, the academics, you know, who just thought it was ludicrous that he was studying this at all. And he certainly would get into a lot of particulars of the Patterson film. He believed in the Patterson film, and he did a lot of studies on it and a lot of measurements on it, also featured in Sasquatch Odyssey, and there were a lot of arguments back and forth about that between Rene and him.
Evidently, he faced a lot of scorn within the academic community for doing that. It didn't seem to bother him all that much, or at least he got to a point where he had a choice to make, and he made it. He came down on the side of wanting to try to conclusively prove that there was a creature out there, and whatever reputation problems he had attached to that, he was willing to bear.
Rene de Hinden was born in Switzerland and moved to Canada at the age of 23, where he would dwell for the remainder of his life. He was an outspoken supporter of the notorious Patterson-Gimlin Sasquatch film, and also embarked on many personal research expeditions into the Pacific Northwest. So charismatic and intriguing was de Hinden's life that a character in the popular film Harry and the Hendersons was inspired by his exploits, and he was also an accomplished author.
Rene de Hinden is probably the most eclectic and the most, I don't want to say he had the most polished persona, because I don't think it was a persona. I think it was just him being Rene de Hinden, that he had one goal in mind, and that was to find the answer, to find the creature itself. And if he had to befriend these other researchers in order to do that, that was fine, but not necessary. And it almost always ended up in some relationship being broken or some bridge being burned. But not to mention the fact that there was a personal toll that the search for Bigfoot took in Rene de Hinden's family life. And in every interview that he ever gave, it seemed like that was an acceptable loss for him, which I think is hard for most people to understand. And kind of the image that we have of de Hinden is out there in the wilderness, in a camper or a tent by himself, basically losing everything else in order to try and be in the right position to find an answer to this search and to find a creature once and for all. And whether or not he had to attach himself to a legitimate researcher, if he had to attach himself to someone like Ivan Marks, who had a very checkered reputation as far as making films and finding evidence is concerned, he was willing to do that if he was at the forefront of being the one to finally solve the mystery. And so he, there's footage that exists, there's interviews that exist of him confronting whoever he thought was doing things foolishly, or which usually meant in his case wasn't doing things the way he thought they should be done, but just almost without question is one of the most singular personalities in the Bigfoot search among the early wave of researchers, and certainly even among the Four Horsemen.
Okay, so Rene de Hinden, crazy, kooky, funny. He had some of the best comebacks of all time, snappy one-liners. He was, everybody liked to be with him because he was a storyteller, but he also had a very serious research side of him, and he was quite possessive of the rights that he had to the Patterson film. The still rights is what he owned, and so there was a businessman side to him as well.
Rene de Hinden was kind of the non-scientific, grumpy, wanted to do it his way kind of personality.
Rene de Hinden, who was from Switzerland, moved over in the 50s to British Columbia, was initially a very good friend of John Green.
Rene and John Green were partners at one time and very close. They had a bit of a falling out when I met them. And it's, I'm not sure why, all the politics of it, but there were a lot of politics involved, and maybe had to do with the rights to the Patterson stills. I mean, who really knows? But I know that they didn't get along. And then Grover Krantz And Renee didn't get along because Renee thought most of the scientific stuff was blown out of proportion, and he hadn't done the field work that Renee had done. He hadn't lived in tents out in the forest, and it was all academic and in his mind.
The relationship between all of them was tenuous. John Green said that how could all of these egos fit in one room? And they all had to have enormous egos to keep on the hunt, to really have all those distractors and skeptics, at bay all the time. So John Green and Renee DeHinden were very close for a long time, and then Renee, who became a very crusty sort of individual, kind of pushed John away. Peter Byrne and John Green never liked each other. Green said some pretty intriguing things about Peter Byrne stealing some of his photographs and presenting evidence that was maybe based upon Byrne's need to keep the funders happy. And then Grover Krantz got angry at all of them. Renee DeHinden very famously criticized Grover Krantz for being, a stick in the mud and all of this. And of course, Grover Krantz would say some incredible things about him being almost near God, in his view of the world, that his view was the only right view. But they all felt that at one time or another. And they worked together and they didn't work together. They've appeared at conferences together and haven't sometimes. So it's 2018. 3 of them are dead, and Peter Byrne is outliving everyone. And those that outlive all of the emperors get to write the history. And it's kind of intriguing to watch what's going on.
Sadly, none of the 4 horsemen remain with us today. John Green passed away in 2016, Grover Krantz in 2002, and Renee DeHinden in 2001. Peter Byrne, the longest surviving member of the exclusive and venerated club, passed away in 2023. Their writings, lectures, and the thousands of reports they leave behind provide a starting point for many millennial Bigfoot researchers. The old guard of the Bigfoot world may have left us, but the standards they set, the roads they paved, and the legacy they leave behind endures, perhaps now more noticeably than ever.
I got into it heavily in 1984. What got me into it was the fact that I had picked up John Green's book, Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us, at the Dover Library. And I had read it cover to cover, and I thought, just on a whim, I'll try and give him a call, see if I can get a hold of him, because a lot of publishers, authors of books, it's a real hard thing to get a hold of them. I called information, got his phone number, talked to him for an hour and a half, and
I never really knew there was other people that believed in Bigfoot besides me, here and there, but it wasn't something that I naturally just would bring up randomly, So when I was an archaeologist on the Sequoia National Forest, very young in my career, the Thule Indian Reservation tribe took me in very much as oh, here's somebody who's not tribal who believes in Bigfoot, and they conveyed to me a lot of their traditional stories and beliefs, and and how to kind of go about talking to Native people. But I didn't really search that out because I thought I was an enigma, and that the Thule River Indian Reservation was an enigma, and the fact that they had these hairy man pictographs was an enigma. And I moved into my new position, which I'm still in 20 years later, and I discovered the internet. And on the internet, I discovered the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, and that there were other people that were grouped to study sightings that were coming in, and I was like, wow. And so I contacted them. I was immediately asked to join, and already in their ranks was John Green, Grover Krantz, Jeff Meldrum, a whole host of people. And so Grover Krantz contacted me through that process, and he was just very good on his advice. He's kind of a curmudgeon in the sense of, you don't know what you're getting yourself into kind of thing, Kathy. I hope you're happy where you are in your career, because you're never going to go anywhere further if you tell people you're a Bigfooter.
In the years that followed the spread of these and many other early rumors, a core group of early researchers took to the forests and hills in pursuit of these legendary creatures. Since the early days, thousands of eyewitness reports, with more popping up all the time, roll in every year via reporting and tracking organizations, online comments, interview testimonials, and more. As the legacy of the Four Horsemen and their contemporaries became cemented within the Sasquatch field and spread beyond it, more and more people would deign to take up the mantle. People from far-flung parts of the world who would likely never have heard of John Green, Renee DeHinden, Grover Krantz, and Peter Byrne were it not for the grand unifying factor which tied them all together: Bigfoot. Those who would come later, who continued the search in the years to follow, further pushed the bounds of what had, up until that point, been thought of as a phenomenon limited to the Pacific Northwest and a few other notable places such as the Himalayas. They would challenge the idea that other parts of North America are devoid of their own sightings, helping to usher the search through the final decades of the 20th century and to find its footing in the 21st.
Hello, my name is Thomas Steenberg, and we are in the temporary Sasquatch Museum and Info Center in downtown Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia. Well, the first one I ever looked at, the first one that's ever reported to me, I can't remember if he was from Australia or New Zealand, but he was a visitor, and he had rented a car, and he was going through the Stony Indian Reserve, and he saw this thing cross in front of his car. The way he described it was a bipedal orangutan. So I asked him, well, you should phone this guy up, and the guy showed my ad. And he did. He said, you got apes in the Canadian Rockies? He didn't realize there was such a thing here, because he'd never heard of the Sasquatch or Bigfoot. He had heard of the Yeti in Nepal. So I went out and I met him there, and there was definitely scuff marks where something went up, but he was more stunned. He wanted me to explain it away. So that intrigued me. And that's how I got started. And now it's over 200 interviews later, and 44 years. Yeah.
My name's John Kirk, and I was born British in the British territory of Hong Kong, and I moved to Canada in 1987 and got straight into the world of cryptids quite by accident, and have stayed immersed in there ever since. 36 years of an absolutely bizarre and crazy ride, but worth every minute of it. And I got involved in the Sasquatch mystery when I moved back to BC because, again, there were all these numerous reports of this creature, and a lot of them extremely credible, especially among First Nations people who are living with these things for donkey's ages. And it behooved us to investigate this animal as well and find out more about it. So I took my first trip out to Harrison Hot Springs in 1987. You can just feel the presence of this animal there, or humanoid, hominid, whatever you want to call it, bipedal, hairy human in some people's minds. But Sasquatch is what fires up this region. This is what it's all about. And if you were to talk to anybody about a preference between Sasquatch and Ogopogo in BC, more people know about what the hell Sasquatch does than they do Ogopogo.
I started in the field investigating Bigfoot, UFOs, cryptid reports back in 1965. And I was already aware of the alleged Bigfoot sightings here in Pennsylvania from the historical records. I had heard reports that people had seen these things, but I began to investigate some sightings in the late 1960s. During that time period, we were receiving reports from down around the small communities down around Hermione, West Newton, Lober, here in Westmoreland County. And back then they had what they called the Lober monster. And people reporting this 7-8 foot tall, hairy creature with long arms. Some people reported that it had white hair, that we on occasion did receive reports of these creatures with shaggy white hair. And they were finding large tracks down there. And that was some of the early reports that I was hearing. And then as I was investigating a number of UFO sightings, not that far from the Chestnut Ridge, out around New Alexandria, PA, back in the late 1960s, I began to hear rumors and talk about a lot of strange activity along what was known as the Chestnut Ridge area, that mountain range. And that's when I began to look into those reports. And apparently for years and years, there have been many, many Bigfoot accounts all along the Chestnut Ridge, especially along the dairy side of the ridge here in Westmoreland County.
So in August of '84, a local article, Newcomer Sound News article, appeared about unusual creatures being seen in the Newcomer Sound area. They were a large bird, they were a large cat, like a mountain lion, And then there were a 7 to 8 foot tall, hair covered, upright, walking, bipedal, human-like creature just outside of town. And I thought, what a coincidence. You know, this comes out in August of '84, late August. I read the book in July of '84. So I went to the news office and talked to the people up there that I knew. And by luck, I was able to talk to all 3 of the eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen it earlier that year, and went to the exact location just on the south side of the Tuscarawas River, which runs along the border of New Cumberstown, and was able to talk to the boys who claimed to have seen it. And I talked to them individually and I talked to them as a group. And upon leaving them, after I had talked to them, I was convinced that they were convinced that they had seen something. And one of the boys' fathers, he went to the area within a few days of when they had claimed to have seen it, which is in March of '84. And they said it was standing beside a tree. And so they found the tree, apparently, and the boy's father found some footprints, very large human-like tracks in the soil. And he told him, he said, don't come back here. And so they didn't, except for when I drug them out there and wanted to see the area.
1986, I looked into a case in which over 100 tracks were found along Baldbeard Creek on the Chilliwack River. I don't think they could have been faked. I can't rule it out completely, but I don't think they could have been faked. An American couple up from Salt Lake City was attending the expo, because that was expo year in Vancouver. First week, they did what she wanted. They went into Vancouver and did expo. The second week of the vacation, they did what he wanted, which is camping and fishing. And while they were camping at the Riverside Campground along the Chilliwack River, they said this big gorilla-like thing came and stole a stringer of fish they had hanging on a tree. And I heard about it, and I got there, and I just caught them as they were leaving. And they told me the whole story, and I found the tracks. They never knew they were there. I found the tracks. I crossed the road, and I found the tracks along the banks of Baldbeard Creek. If I hadn't been for that find, I might have put the Sasquatch on the back burner and gone on to what my ex-wife used to say, more important things. But that find did it for me. There was no way I was giving up on it. No way I was giving up on it, yeah. Also, the Crandall Campground incident of the May long weekend of 1988 in Waterton Lakes National Park, where 4 witnesses all saw this thing, and they actually had the courage to report it to the park warden's office the next day. Most people don't. They did, and the warden's office did an investigation. And no matter how much they tried to dissuade these people that they saw a bear, he was impressed. The warden was a man named Alan Davies. He was very impressed. They would not be deterred. And one of them insisted on writing something out. You know, so and I'm sure that report is still on file in the warden's office at Waterton Lakes National Park. Yeah, yeah.
I think the thing that really nailed it for me in regard to the existence of this animal were several experiences I had that just simply cannot be accounted for in any other way, that it was a Sasquatch was the point of origin. In 1997 in May, I was up at the Seymour Demonstration Forest, which is on the north shore of Vancouver, up in the North Vancouver Mountains, and I got separated from my group. They all went cycling and I didn't have a bike, so I had to walk. And I was walking along this path all by myself with nobody else around, and I looked down and I see a footprint on the other side of the path, a 15-inch footprint. I'm going, what the heck is this? Then I looked next to me and there was the other one, okay? The left foot was on this side, the right foot was on that side, and the step length was over 40 inches. A single step from the heel to the toe. And I thought to myself, ye gods, man, there's been a Sasquatch around here, and I could smell the lingering odor. It was unpleasant, to say the least, but it wasn't as bad as most people think. This thing had gone and it was lingering. In 1998, I was visiting my dad, who was the mayor of the town of North Bonneville in Washington State. And it was Christmas Eve. My dad was making the Christmas dinner ready to be served the next morning. And he has a big picture window that looks into the forest down there in southern Washington. So he went out for a cigarette, and all of a sudden he says, can you come out here, please? And I said, okay, what the heck's going on here? And I walk out there, he's standing there white as a sheet. And I said, what's the problem? And he says, look in the snow. 17.5-inch tracks in the snow. you know, massive step lengths, walking straight into the bush behind his house. Now, North Bonneville is in Skamania County, well-known habitat for Sasquatch sightings. So I looked at these tracks and they were far deeper into the snow than either my dad's or mine. But I looked at them and I remembered them. I sort of burned those images into my memory. And one day I was looking at pictures from Skamania County of another set of footprints from Buncombe Hollow. And I looked at them and said, holy cow, those are the same ones that went through my dad's backyard.
One in particular was up in Beach Hills between Greensburg and Jeanette in 73. This incident happened early morning hours, and this person was staying at some friend's home. Well, the home at the time was a very low foundation, very low to the ground. Early morning hours, person went into the bathroom and was beginning to hear these strange sounds outside. And as she's sitting there, she's a foot or two from the window. As she's sitting there, this hideous face appears right in front of her. She was looking directly at it. She's seeing the hairy face, the luminous blue, kind of orangish, reddish, glowing eyes, big fang-like teeth, and the face is more wolf-like. She was very, very upset, ran out of there, told the people what happened. They called the state police. I interviewed her within a few minutes. They had called me and I interviewed her. I know one of the troopers went out, found some possible three-toed tracks near that place. She was so upset that she made the people take her to her home several miles away. And interestingly, and this has been found in a couple other cases we had, within the hour after she got home, the same or a similar creature showed up at her property.
Well, a little bit of history in a nutshell. First of all, I got into it in '84, and my last fairly active year was 2012. So the reason I say that is because the first half of that time span, we would get phone calls or letters, and people would contact me, say, hey, I seen something cross the road. Well, I want to pick up Mary Jo at a basketball game. Okay, well, do you mind if I come out and take a look at the area and talk to you about it? Later, in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, we would probably get, more often than not, emails or submission form reports, or people coming to my meeting that I held on a regular basis and telling us about what they had seen. The good thing about receiving the reports electronically was you would get the report quickly. I mean, you could have a sighting at 9 p.m. and at 9:15 p.m. you could have it reported into your local Bigfooter. In the early 2000s, in 1985, it didn't work that way. You did have to get a phone call or a letter. But back to the point for 15 minutes later, if you don't want to talk to the investigator, you can come up with the best BS story that you can think of, make it sound perfectly legitimate and real, and if that investigator wasn't doing his job, they could just put it out on the internet and there's another report that's fake, but you can't tell the difference because no one has gone to the spot, talked to the person face to face to see what their reaction was, and gone to the area to see if it could be, habituated by a large upright creature or not. So I think we have a good thing as far as being able to almost instantly communicate as far as what's happening out there, but it's a bad thing because if people won't, I made it a habit after a while that if they didn't want to talk to you, if they wouldn't give you a phone number, if they wouldn't meet you, I'd throw the report out.
The history of Sasquatch is long, winding, and packed with minutiae. After all of this, the pursuit of Bigfoot has defined careers, impacted lives, and changed the way the Earth is viewed for millions of people. It has presented us with something of a different reality, a world where the greatest mysteries are yet unsolved, and where, on any given day, someone might stumble across the answer. It drives legions to venture into the wilderness and seek out the legendary, perhaps even mythical, wood ape. The journey also continues. It did not end with the Four Horsemen, the flaps of the 60s and 70s, nor the renewed fervor of the 80s and 90s. More than just shots in the dark and hopeful maybes, the brightly burning torch is still being passed, carried by a whole new generation of Sasquatch hunters.